I want to be Beatie Wolfe when I grow up. Problem is, I'm already older than Beatie is, so I think I've missed my chance. She is an amazing creator and technologist who has tried to recreate what we think of the physical album to go with modern music. She's done some amazing things, has been celebrated by the V&A, Barbican, all sorts of great folks. You'll understand her story as she has taken apart what we think of as the album and created physical and experiences that go with that modern music. You may have seen her on stages. She'll be speaking at South by Southwest and the virtual South by coming up in March. Please enjoy Beatie and stay tuned for the rest of this episode. Beatie, I really appreciate having met you and Nick and all the great adventures I've seen you guys having just in the past couple of years. As we kind of wind our way into the conversation, what is your current work in the world? What are you doing now?
Well, I mean, now, as you mentioned, it's November 2020. We're still in the middle of a very surreal year and lockdown and everything sort of hitting, you know, politically, environmentally, socially, societally, personally. And so, you know, with that kind of as a backdrop, the two main projects I've been working on, you know, the first is a continuation of my environmental protest piece From Green to Red, which will be out at the London Design Biennale next year. And the other one is a project that's actually kind of specific to the context of these times. It was born out of lockdown and it's called Postcards for Democracy. And it's something I've been working on with Mark Mothersbough from Devo. So those are the two main things that are keeping me busy right now.
For most creative people, I know that they have sort of a set of areas that they work in and then sometimes dabble in other spaces. And for the time I've known you, you are incredibly diverse in the areas in which you work. I think I met you right after you had put out the album that was the RFID cards.
The deck of cards, yeah.
The deck of cards where you're rethinking the album. And so I tend to think of my joy in meeting you was the fact that you were rethinking the physical space of the digital content. And since then, you've done hordes of other things. And before that, you've done hordes of other things. So I feel we could talk for hours just on the realm of work that you touch. But can I get you to back up into your starting spot? When you were getting started as a young person, were you a creator then, a performer, singer, songwriter early, had nothing to do with that? What was your early starting point in all this?
Well, it's funny because actually the early starting point almost feels like, well, firstly, it informed everything that I've done, but it feels as if I'm still that kid who is trying to find a tangible, you know, ceremonial experience around music, you know, which I had as a kid with my parents' record collection, you know, stumbling upon that when I was sort of 7 or 8. And at that point, I'd already started writing songs. Like I was very, you know, I was very sort of in love with storytelling as a general kind of medium. And then realizing I could put these stories to music, that just felt like that moment that made sense to me. So from that point, you know, again, around 7 or 8, I was, you know, writing songs, but then having kind of encountered these musical books, which was how I saw them, and opening them up and entering into the worlds of these albums and this tangible art form and this ceremony and this story that you were kind of being, you know, taken on. That was so captivating for me. And I spent most of my childhood imagining, you know, well, what worlds am I going to create for my albums? What are they going to look like? What are they going to feel like? You know, where can I take people? And by the time I grew up, everything that I loved, that whole physical listening music experience, had been replaced by the digital one. And it was like we'd gone from one to the other so quickly, we hadn't really figured out how to combine the best of both worlds. And I felt like, we'd sort of really missed a trick in figuring out what we could still preserve, but also where we could innovate. So in some ways, my childhood creative sense or self is still really very much alive in everything that I do, because I'm essentially trying to reimagine a vinyl experience, but for today. And I just happen to use technology often as a sort of invisible facilitator to create, ironically, a more tangible, ceremonial, story-led, immersive experience, for music which is otherwise floating around in this intangible sphere.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in South London. So I was, I had an American father, British mother, and, my parents split up when I was a baby. So I really grew up with my mum and my brother in Land's End.
What was on the turntable?
Abbey Road. No, I mean, that is the one that just really imprinted. And it's not that was the only one. But, when I more recently did this album experience, Raw Space, which was this kind of anti-stream from the quietest room on earth, that was the most realized version of this vision of recreating the feeling I had as a 7-year-old opening up Abbey Road and just feeling as if, the lyrics, the artwork, everything was just coming to life around you as this sort of perfect stage for the music, before you even put the needle on the record. But so Abbey Road was in there, but actually it was very eclectic because my mum, unbeknownst to me and my brother, had done all this stuff in punk rock, this documentary and this kind of definitive book on the British scene in 1977. And for some reason she, we never knew about that. So we grew up with her as a therapist and a writer, but we didn't know about the music side of that. So, she'd have a lot of Sex Pistols records or, The Damned or The Who. And then it ranged from that through to, some of my dad's stuff, which again, even though they weren't together, that was obviously a part of our childhood. And that was more Donny Hathaway, Roberta Flack, these great jazz records. So I think from a very young age, I just remember, that kind of wonderful thing of chancing on something that was just so electrifying. And, thank God my parents had pretty good taste, I guess.
Makes you think almost of and we've had several guests on who their parents' record collection, or in some cases older siblings, was some of what got them intrigued. And you think about now in a household that you really don't see mom or dad's record collection or even their CD collection because it's sitting on their computer and in their smartphone. And so the sort of intergenerational listening or archiving might be a really interesting gap or lack of an engagement. I don't know. Because it's interesting how people understand or don't understand the sort of creative meanderings of their parents. And it sounds like you had an opportunity, but an indirect one, to see your mom's meanderings professionally, but through the archive of her record collection.
Yeah. And I mean, it's something that I never even put together until I was in my 20s, so actually I only found out about her punk stuff through a music journalist, editor, Craig Marks, who had, got a hold of my mom's book and film and was going to interview me it was the first album I came out with, which was a theatre for the palm of the hand, a way of turning the phone into this kind of 80s Viewmaster. And he was interviewing me for that. And I remember meeting for a cup of tea or something in New York. And he's like, oh, your mom's punk stuff is just amazing. And I had no idea about it. So, that it was sort of uncovering this whole other, side of her, but also then going back to some of the things we had in the house and sort of thinking about them with, suddenly being able to piece it together. And similarly with my dad, my dad's a rare bookseller. And so, he always had these rare books, Darwin, Galileo, Copernicus, Ptolemy. He had them in his flat because he couldn't afford a shop. And I remember being so terrified to handle them or touch them, but, wanting to as a kid. And he was like, no, these were made to last. You can look through these as long as you're careful. And that also imprinted on me this idea that something could be an art form, but also a sort of vehicle of knowledge, and a portal in time. But with him as well, I grew up with him as a rare bookseller. And it wasn't until I was, 16 and in the car, listening to Sympathy for the Devil with him, it was on the radio. And I was turning it up and he was turning it down. And I was thinking, oh, he doesn't like this music. He likes, his jazz and classical, and he doesn't understand it. And at the end of the song, under his breath, he goes, there is a line in this song about me. And I just remember thinking, who is this person sitting next to me? And so both my mom and my dad had a very interesting interesting past with my mom and the punk stuff, and my dad and the beat culture. But they I don't know, they never really, they went on and did other things. They were very much their own people, and they were very independent, and I think they never romanticized any of that stuff, so they never ended up really talking about it. So it's
Do they support you heading into creative direction? So is there voices from them encouraging you to be creative because or despite their past?
Yes, yes and no. I think that's always a hard one to answer because being a musician, obviously a lot of people would worry, you're not gonna, make any money and all that stuff, which is a reality, let's face it. And I think both my mom and my dad knew what it was like to have very little, and knew what it was like to, also to be very creative, but, sometimes that wouldn't work out. So I think, my mom was definitely very supportive. My dad, I think, he was worried. He was really worried it was going to be very difficult. And, he tried to get me to consider other careers. And that was actually almost part of knowing as well that, what I wanted to do was really bigger than just, I want to go and, sing on stage or whatever. It was really this sense of a purpose and a mission, and I didn't know exactly what it was or how it was going to unfold, but I knew that was why I was here in some ways. And so having those kind of discussions and me having to be really, crystal clear that I was going to do it regardless, that I think was actually very, very ultimately positive because it made me more resolute. I think sometimes if you have you have it too easy, or if you have, people saying, wow, yeah, you're amazing, your parents usually, that complacency can be quite, it's often, in my opinion, the kind of greatest enemy of creativity. So having opposition, having challenge, having constantly trying to get my dad's approval, constantly trying to get him to say, well done, things like that were a huge motivating factor in sort of fueling me to just keep going.
So what was the journey between the 16-year-old listening to Sympathy for the Devil on the car radio to before you then launched the Theater for the Palm of the Hand? What was the journey in between? Where did you get to?
Ooh, well, I was in a band at that time, a grungy sort of female-fronted Led Zeppelin meets AC/DC kind of band. all original. You know, I wrote the songs and played lead guitar, and then my best friend sang a lot of them, but then I did harmonies, and we had a male bassist and drummer, and we had a lot of interest. You know, we had people wanting to give us management deals or little record deals. And, you know, I remember at that age sort of really sitting down and thinking, wow, you know, this is obviously very kind of encouraging or flattering, and seems like it could be quite cushy. You know, obviously as a 16-year-old, the idea of you know, getting some money and all those things, it's quite it's quite hard to say no. And I just remember having this moment of thinking, well, could I really imagine, you know, putting out these kind of songs for the next 5 years or 10 years? You know, because they were very angsty. I mean, in the way that you would expect. You know, our songs Troubled, Asylum, Let It Boil. You know, it was really, really dire.
Calm and peaceful music.
Yeah. And
just the joy just coming right off the guitar strings.
Exactly. And so I just had this feeling that, you know, it was a period that I was in at that time, and it was authentic. God, it was very real, and it wasn't, you know, put on in any way. But I wasn't necessarily going to be there for, you know, the 5 years, 10 years to come. So I ended up sort of turning down a lot of things, which I think other people may not have. And, you know, and then I sort of ended up, you know, splitting with this friend and doing my own thing, and then having, you know, again, various producers, different people wanting to work with me, but then, oh, hey, instead of doing your acoustic music, can you sing over this electronic beat, you know? And I was like, well, yeah, that's just really not me at all. Or sitting in Simon Fuller's, you know, management office and seeing all these people that, again, I just couldn't relate to, and them wanting me to be on the books. And I think it was a process of figuring out what I didn't want to do. Was you know, 16 until the Palm Top Theatre. And that was really, really helpful, because again, it's like with opposition, it can make you stronger. Well, with things that don't feel right, and being able to say no to them, even when all your friends would be like, why, you know, you should totally take that. It was constantly kind of reasserting that, you know, the reason why I was doing it, and the intention, and the fact that it had to be right, and it had to be, you know, on my terms, and it had to be my vision. And so, yeah, I think that was all sort of fuel and food ahead of putting out the first record.
Is there a switch that flipped? Something that triggered you to say it is time? Because when you stepped out into the work I know you for, it's all unique. Tends to be a singular comment, but it's incredibly unique, right? That it's really a road less traveled. So is there something that made it the right time, or something that tripped you into that process?
You mean the sort of beginning of that kind of thinking, or?
Yeah, the fact that it sounds like you definitely it was baking for a while, thinking through the manifestation, the physical manifestation of the digital,
yeah,
or the ritualized elements. But was there something that made that the right time to head that direction?
Yeah, you know,
the right partners, the right something that happened?
I mean, I think it was just, so before, you know, even before 8, which was the first record, 2012, I had done this EP, which I rarely talk about, which, you know, was me. It was me as you know it. And it was 2010, and I released it as as this little app with visuals and, you know, obviously the songs and the liner notes. So that was almost like a precursor to 8 that had, again, it was the seed of that thinking, there has to be another way of releasing music. And for me, it was just the most obvious thing. You know, when I had 8, you know, the tracks for 8 ready, and it was, you know, going to come out because I'd sat on it for a while, and I was like, no, I want to get this out. And obviously, it was going to be a record because it was always going to be a record, and it would be a lyric book. So it would be those, old school formats, and then it would be on iTunes and all of that. But I just couldn't get over that, there wasn't something that was combining digital and physical. And it just felt like it was the most obvious thing to, find a way of presenting it in a kind of old school way, but that also was totally different and totally innovative, and giving it this twist that no one had experienced before. And I remember thinking at the time, well, this is what everyone's going to do. Like, it's so obvious that we've kind of moved to these polar opposites, and there's nothing in between, and there's nothing that's bridging the digital and physical. So that's got to be the most logical place to go as an artist. And, it's funny because obviously, I look back and I'm like, wow, I was convinced that it was just the most common thinking. But, I see now maybe it wasn't. So I think that it, like some of those great ideas, and I don't mean that in a way of patting myself on the back. I mean it in the sense of us being antennae, that pick things up and things come through, and we are conduits for bringing ideas into being. It just felt like it had to exist. It felt like there had to be these different ways of experiencing records, that were captivating and new and sort of exciting, but also very familiar and very intuitive and inclusive. And so, 8 was really the beginning of that in terms of that kind of proof of concept, I think.
So then when you came out then with your next piece of work, this is where it's frustrating to have it that we're talking about things to go with audio. To describe what you do in audio is interesting, right? Because it's like trying to physically, I almost want to gesture when talking about things you built and made. So when you started looking at sort of the way to artifact and ritualize the work, what was the sort of series that you stepped out on that people can go look for now?
Ooh, how do you mean?
So when you started looking at ways to then have accompanying physical artifacting, can you describe where you went from there? Because again, it'd be great to show people the physical right now, but they get to hear about it.
Oh, I see. Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
So then turning it into a metaphorical viewmaster.
Yeah.
How did you think about it, and how did you do the work?
Well, yeah. I mean, so the first album, was literally turning your phone into a mini theater for the palm of the hand, which looked very much like an 80s Viewmaster, where you could watch the record play in this 3D sort of holographic way. The second record was, a deck of cards, an album as a deck of cards, and it looked a bit like a cassette tape. So you could open it up and you had a series of cards corresponding to each song off the album with the lyrics and the artwork and the liner notes, and you would tap that card to your phone, and via an invisible chip it would instantly bring up the song, the music video, all of that content. But again, it looked like it was a cassette tape. It came in this very nostalgic sort of form. And then the other part of that, reimagining the album jacket, which again was a big love of mine, the ability for the jacket to tell a story. And again, those got reduced to, thumbnail size. So as a sort of counterpart to the deck of cards, the album was released as this one-off album jacket that was cut by the tailor who dressed Bowie, Hendrix, and Jagger out of fabric woven with my music, that was recorded in the room where McCartney wrote Eleanor Rigby and Hendrix wrote The Wind Cries Mary, as this sort of centerpiece. But really this way of rethinking the album jacket and it telling these multiple,
as a physical, wearable, gorgeous, glorious physical jacket.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And I just loved the fact that it had all these threads symbolically, but also literally, that were telling the story of the room, of this incredible flat with so much musical history, and this tailor who had dressed so many of my favorite musicians and who lived in this flat. And then obviously of this record, and it was all woven together, and you could, tap your phone onto the jacket to hear the music that was woven into it. But actually that was the least interesting part for me. And then the third record was, an anti-stream from the quietest room on earth as a physical record stream, playing 24 hours for a week on repeat. And people could log in, via the 360 cameras. It was the first live 360 video, and they could explore that space. They couldn't shuffle. They couldn't fast forward, wherever the record was, that's what they were hearing. But then using live animations, the lyrics would be streaming out of the vinyl, the artwork would be surrounding you and taking you into the visual landscape of each track as it was playing in real time. So you were sort of in this modern day Fantasia experience. And it really did feel like, all of the stuff that we were missing from streaming, I was trying to bring back into the equation in this fashion that felt, seamless. So that was Raw Space. And then I, after that, did a sort of space broadcast using the Holmdel horn antenna with the Nobel Prize winning scientist who had used the horn to pick up cosmic microwave radiation and prove the theory of the Big Bang. And he and I did a space beam of raw space, as just a nice way to finish that story. And then I was very sort of fortunate to be able to present these designs, which by that point also included a space chamber, so I'd figured out a way of representing raw space in a fashion where people didn't have to use VR headsets, because almost from the get-go, like, I had no interest in them, but I love the idea of sort of taking people back into that world. And so using a coin-operated viewport, the kind that you would look out to sea, in this mylar-wrapped space chamber, people were able to watch the record come to life with the animations and the artwork. And it was wonderful because everyone from a grandparent to a kid knew how to use, the old viewport. So I presented all these designs that I'd come up with in a solo exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, working with the Bowie curatorial team. And that was, without a doubt, one of my life highlights.
And we'll have show note links to all of this because this is such a visual and textural motif that it's hard to even describe it in the time we've got here. So, and very visual. So I'm going to definitely be sharing this stuff in the links. But a lot of this isn't necessarily the traditional scale models, right? So in many ways, digital music has become this music as water motif where it's just flowing everywhere, and some efforts to maybe make VIP experiences or high-priced experiences that still had some scale and intimacy, but you're instead creating story art that is physical and spatial and all of this, but not really looking at scale by its design, because it sounds like these are very boutique, intimate story conversations.
I think they are. I mean, I had offers to, to roll out some of these designs or formats at points in my life. And I had no desire, because this was my curiosity, my exploration. And it was never about creating one definitive design that was suddenly gonna be the way everyone listened to music. I mean, Raw Space really was the most complete, and actually required the least in terms of any, you didn't need anything to be able to enter into it. But no, it was just about me exploring what I thought was interesting and where I thought we could be looking as artists, and hoping that, me doing whatever I'm doing was also inspiring other people to think, oh yeah, I can go and do something different as well. So the idea of sort of figuring out one perfect, format that then could be commercialized was just so not interesting. I mean, I'm looking at a beautiful photo of Leonard Cohen in the room that I'm sitting in, and there was a conversation at one point around him using, or adopting my deck of cards as a way of releasing, I think it was You Want It Darker. And that's a whole other thing, because he's a huge inspiration and muse, or not muse, but, hero. I don't really like that word, but he's someone, I'm deeply inspired by and moved by. And that would have felt very right, and it would have been another artist that you love that is sort of, using something you've created, and that's wonderful. But otherwise, yeah, it's always been about the exploration. It's never been about arriving at a goal, a specific place of saying, yay, figured that out. I don't need to do anything.
Here, I've made it. I've sold it at scale.
Yeah.
But impact is not unimportant. So what did you find that having the Victoria and Albert celebration of your work, did that have impact of doors opening or of inspiring other creators, or did something come of that? Or how has that been as a metric and milestone and catalyst in your life?
Well, metrics in many ways I'm not interested in. Milestone, it was huge. And I think, being able to say it, but actually to know it, being able to know that you've had a solo exhibition, and really the last singer-songwriter before me to be exhibited there was Bowie, and again another huge inspiration for me. So that just meant that was sort of worth its weight in gold, and that was something that I think presenting your work where you're showing this continuation of thought, and while all the outputs might be different, there's a core intention that is informing each one of them, so they're all actually very connected. Seeing, it ended up being hundreds of thousands, 150,000 people who came through there during the time that the show was on, and I was there every day. I was arriving from when the doors opened and leaving when the doors closed, and the people at the museum couldn't really figure it out, because they were like, well, we've never had an artist who's just wanted to be here all the time, that the show is on. And for me, I thought, well, why not? Why wouldn't you? Isn't this the reason that you're doing, the work that you're doing? And I got so much out of seeing people's reactions and seeing the variety of people that were coming through, schools, groups from other countries, engineers, scientists, design students, just all these different types of people. And it was just amazing. I mean, it was exhausting, but it was amazing. And so I think that the kind of magnitude of that, and actually knowing that every person that went into that space chamber, because it was so kind of magical and so immersive, and people would go in and then they'd queue up again to go in again, and we'd done a beta of it at the LA Times, which I think maybe you were at and might have seen, but this was the space chamber 2.0, and it was so wonderful. Mm-hmm. And knowing that would have imprinted, knowing that in 10 years time a lot of people would be able to remember that. I went into this weird, NASA Mylar wrapped room and heard this record, and it watched all these visuals that were real time. And, I think that was a great sense of achievement, sort of feeling like I created something that would have gone in deep.
And that was after you had created something else that had gone in deep with your dementia work. Can you talk about that journey, because it is both different and possibly interwoven?
Yeah, I mean, it's as if I don't have enough enough weird
Well,
stuff.
I'm thinking
to
of all the
talk
other things, all
about.
the LA Times Festival of Books curation, all the other things, the Dub Lab work you're doing. That you've got so many stuff you're going on. So, but that preceded it as well, though, didn't it? That you had been looking to bring music as almost time travel or recall.
Yeah, I mean, so the Music Dementia project, which really began in 2014, and it began with family members, having dementia, and I'd got very interested in the work of Oliver Sacks and everything that he'd done to look at music for autism, schizophrenia, Parkinson's, like every neurological condition. And he was able to show that music was a tonic, a way in when nothing else could penetrate. And so I was so deeply moved by how much he had contributed and how much he'd illuminated. And then finding out that I had family members with Alzheimer's and dementia, I thought, okay, well, I'll take my guitar and see if, playing a few songs might help, and didn't really have any expectations. And from that, and particularly one performance in the north of Portugal, which was meant to just be to my father-in-law, but ended up being to the whole ward of 100, 200 people living with dementia. And I was thinking, okay, I'm singing songs that are in another language that are new, that don't in any way would not trigger a memory. These are not familiar songs. This is probably at best gonna create a nice ambience. And watching people during that performance waking up, singing along, clapping, talking to one another, and feeling just as if you're in a regular performance, and then you think, oh, of course I'm in a care home. And not to say that isn't a regular performance, but, it was such an animated group, and suddenly, you remember. And at the end of the performance, the director of the home came up and said, in the 10 years I've been here, that's the best I've ever seen everyone. And that was really the catalyst behind me feeling like I had to go further and keep pulling this thread and just see what unfolded. And so I began a music dementia research project back in the UK and went into care homes all across the UK and played a set of original songs. And the residents were monitored during the performance, but also after in the weeks following, listening to the same songs on headsets. And, we saw a huge improvement in memory, communication. I saw people who were catatonic get up and dance, people who were nonverbal singing along to these songs they'd never heard. And it was so powerful. And it was just such a huge reminder of how deep music really goes and how we still know so little about it. And it was also really a reminder of doing it, of why we do these things with the highest integrity and we try and make the best art possible, because it's so powerful and it's so core to our humanity. So from that, this charity was formed out of the work that I'd done, Music for Dementia 2020, which is now actively getting music in all care homes in the UK by the end of next year. And I, recently gave a TED Med talk about, obviously this subject specifically, but just in general, where we are today, what we've lost along the way with the rise of technology and how it's fast-tracked so much of what it means to be human, but often without the true cost or value reflected in the process. And when you see how powerful music is, even when you remove the memory component, you have the utmost respect for the power of art. And you just realize that we as human beings have to, we have to keep making the best art possible, and not just thinking about, today and how much gratification we're getting today, but, the long term. And also, I think as just general people on this planet, we are living on a planet with finite resources, and technology is never going to be able to create, additional resources for us to pillage. And so I think, I guess I just feel like it's very important to remember the things that keep us human, and art and nature are really two of the core things that remind us of our humanity.
So earlier in our conversation, we talked about the time that you spent early in your life figuring out what you didn't want to do. Then we've spent time talking about a fraction of the many things you have done. How do you decide, as both a creator and as an independent businesswoman, what projects to pursue?
Well, it doesn't even really feel like a decision, which I know sounds kind of esoteric, but it feels like I have had the same thing on repeat. I've had this record on repeat in my brain, which is just, how do we make deeper, more ceremonial experiences around music and art in general, in this increasingly digital world? And that just, it keeps on going round and round and round. And then wherever I see not an opportunity, but wherever I see something that strikes, strikes a chord or captures my imagination, or inspires me, like a room, or learning about someone, an invention, or seeing, graphs of CO2 in the atmosphere, or whatever it is. It can be anything. And then I think, okay, how do I weave this story together? And so I think because the idea is always the same, or the intention is always the same, then the way that you do it, it just is the specific tools or the right kind of contextual material that's going to tell that story best. And so it never really feels like a decision. It just feels like the next logical step. Like, oh yeah, this has to exist. I think it's when I get the feeling that something has to exist, or that it already does. And I know that it, I see it in my mind's eye, and it's almost as if it's already there. And then I just know that it's going to come together. And then I guess, with the few times that it's been, like the Postcards project, or even the environmental project, with that, because it really is, Mark and I have been doing the Postcards project together. It was, again, and it's different from my main work because it's not related to an album or related to, representing art or music. But I had spent most of my time in lockdown writing letters just as a way of staying sane. And that had brought me so much joy, and, reminded me again of, physical communication over, social media. And again, all the stuff that we've talked about. And hearing that he had made Postcards since the 60s, and knowing that we wanted to do a collaboration together, when USPS was suddenly under attack and we all depended on it for our ability to vote. Again, it just felt like that had to, kind of had to exist. We had to, it would be wonderful to give people an outlet, a creative outlet, but to something that supported USPS and our right to vote ahead of the election, but also that sort of celebrated this lost art that so many of us really love, but we've forgotten about. So I think a lot of my work is about reminding people of these endangered experiences, these things that keep us alive inside that might have got lost along the way, and that, we should reclaim because they're simple things, but they bring us so much joy.
So you've shared a lot of your great projects. We'll have a lot in the show notes. If someone wants to reach out to you, is there a way that they can connect? And Is there anything you are looking for that you'd like someone to reach out for you about?
Well, my name, Beatie Wolfe, which is my real name. Yeah, I mean, you can find, whether it's website or, as much as I don't love social media, but, you can find me on various platforms. But yeah, I'd just say my website and, or, the greater interweb. And I think, is there anything I would like people to send in?
Anything that you want to catalyze or connect on? Other than people to find your great work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not even about, pushing my work on people. If there's stuff that strikes a chord, and obviously, they can go check it out. If there are any things, that whether it's in the music dementia space or the environmental project, things that I think are kind of, more about service in some ways, or just giving back. Obviously, if people have, want to contribute or get involved, that's always wonderful. But otherwise, no, I just think, I think let people find or enjoy whatever strikes a chord.
And there's lots of chords to strike. So, Beatie, thank you for joining us today. And I'm always excited about seeing your next adventures.
Nice, Gigi. Thanks so much for chatting with me.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Beatie Wolfe. Next week on Tuesday, we'll be doing the first segment of our Creative Careers Next Career.me program, so you can get snippets every Tuesday and then enjoy our wonderful interviews each Thursday. Next Thursday, we will have David Hernandez, and you'll hear about his self-made enterprise to be channels and technology in music to expand what people can be doing across their music careers. But for now, join us at nextcareer.me. Come join us at creativeinnovatorspodcast.com, and we'll talk with you next week.